Working. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope we're not in our afternoon sleepy slump time, but we're going to try and make the topic of data really interesting and exciting for you. And I think, it's come up in all the previous panels and discussions today. So clearly there is a lot to talk about here and many different aspects that we could discuss. I was struck by the very first Slido survey that was done that data transparency only received 9% of the votes for the most important issue. But I think, we would all agree that the other categories that people were rating are very much dependent on quality and transparent data sets in order to, achieve those things that people indicated investors were interested in terms of their decision making. So great to have everyone on the panel here. I haven't had a chance to meet some of my panelists because we've all arrived at different times this morning, but it's lovely to have you all on the stage with me, and I hope the questions will, spark some interesting thinking. We have discussed in the previous panels capital allocation, and now we're going to talk about data allocation. And I think, we're all very aware that we live in a world that's completely awash with data. Technology extracts it from us, it spits it back out to us on a daily basis. But I feel like not all data is created equal. And what we really want in this panel is to explore how we can ensure we get quality data that generates quality outcomes, that we're using it ethically to foster inclusion, drive sustainability, and ensure transparency. To ensure that the data generated and the data used is ethical, inclusive, and ideally empowering for those that are providing those data points. So I'm going to ask each of the panellists to just give us some opening thoughts on any of those aspects that I've just mentioned that sort of speaks to you. In terms of, AI, I know, Zia, you are champing at the bit to talk about AI. So maybe I'll ask you first and then, see how others react to that.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for inviting Microsoft to this important moment. Thanks, Trisha. What is data? It is a precursor to a decision. The decision making is really what we should be talking about. The systems that help us make a decision about whether to extend credit, how much we should charge for an insurance policy, whether or not we should give someone a specific drug or another, how to improve a health outcome. Data is the precursor. Decision making is what we really should be talking about. The systems that allow us to make good decisions need to be ethical. That means without having any biases. Fair, because the person that's making the decision has to be devoid of any influence. And transparent. In many ways, the reason I continue to be a tech optimist in this era of AI, when it's so easy to get worried about data and the inequities with regards to data, is that the future for me 4 years from now, when we have the next major Orange Forum, will be that we've achieved many of the outcomes through fair systems that are ethical and transparent, for which AI plays a role. Without giving it all away right up front, we will live in a much better time as a result of the systems that are fairer and more just, and that companies like ours will help implement with you.
Thank you. Good to have an optimist in the room kicking us off. So I think, part of this is around the democratization of information. And that was always the promise, the great promise of the internet and potentially of AI as well. And, what is it going to take for us to actually achieve that promise? Because the world is a very different contexts around the world in which data is generated and used. So, Divya, I wanted to ask you, many of the regions where Ishk Tolaram Foundation operates have traditionally been excluded from the broader data access. So how can data and technology play a role in bridging this gap, this digital divide, I guess. How can communities themselves perhaps use this data and not just have it extracted from them for decisions that are made by other people?
Thanks so much for that question. So just to give a little bit of context, I represent a family foundation, and we have operations in Singapore, in Indonesia, and in Nigeria, which is some of the geographies where we do, most of our impact data collection as well. So I think, what I see on the ground, because we're a programmatic foundation, we run all our programs ourselves, we are very close to our beneficiaries as well. And what I see on the ground is that the advances in data, in network infrastructure, in technology is still very far behind compared to what our target users, our target demographic can benefit from. So, while at one level we really talk a lot about, how infrastructure has advanced, I think we need to remember that a lot of this advancement is still beneficial for people in urban areas. So like if I go into rural Indonesia, Wi-Fi access is still a really big issue. Even online training programs that we deliver, we have to bring our participants together into like a community center where they can all access Wi-Fi. So, these technology, I don't think it's been as evenly distributed and evenly accessible. And that has a big impact, of course, on the kind of data that we can get back. So when it comes to self-reported data, I think from urban communities, it's much easier because, again, they have, better Wi-Fi, better access. Rural communities, it's still very hard for us. So that's one point of it. The second thing I think we do need to remember is that whoever we're extracting this data from, it's a cost to them. Data is a very valuable commodity. It's gold. Is somebody going to spend data on watching a YouTube video to entertain them at the end of a really tiring day? Or are they going to use that data to answer like a 15-minute survey, which they don't even know what the value is going to be for them, right? Again, like you said, that's useful to me.
We all love surveys so much.
Right? And that's really useful to me, but do they care about it and why, right? So I think that's something else to keep in mind. So when we talk about self-reported data, I think that's still quite challenging. Where I think data and technology has been very useful is when we have used enumerators for our programs, because they can use low-cost tablets, very easy tech solutions to collect data from communities that's required. Where we still find it lacking is on the analysis part. Now, I think that's somewhere, Zia, like what you were talking about earlier, if you can have like large pools of data and where AI comes and plays a really big role on analyzing what that data means and what can be done with data, that's really useful. But again, the concern that I have is, am I actually robbing communities from building up their own capability? Because instead of helping communities actually improve their analytical skills, I'm just saying, you know what, you can't do it. Here is like technology that's going to do it, right? So I think it's great in one way. It really helps in a lot of ways. But I think there's also like a lot of concerns on, does the limited access and lack of access in different communities actually disadvantage them?
Yeah, it's a bit about feedback loops potentially as well. I think I wonder if we're being a bit optimistic and utopian when, as you say, these communities, they often have accessibility issues, time poor. Yes, okay, they've agreed to provide this data for us, and then when we turn around and say, okay, now you use it, you analyse it, you make your lives better. Like, it has to be a much more collaborative process potentially, so that it isn't a burden, but it's actually seen as a benefit. So Candice, I wanted to ask you, in terms of this inclusive data, now that we've got it, how do we ensure that it's not just used for compliance, but it's really being used to drive measurable and impactful outcomes, and how do we bring the communities themselves into that process of using data to get impact and outcomes?
Thanks for the question. So maybe to start off with, I'll just explain a little bit about the perspective that Sustainable Fitch is bringing to this discussion. So we are a ESG ratings agency, a sister organization of our better-known credit ratings agency, Fitch Ratings. Basically what we do is we conduct independent assessments of transactions, typically the labeled bonds, so green, social, sustainability-linked debt instruments, as well as at the entity level. So a role that we often play when we talk about the labeled bond market is coming in to provide second-party opinions. And that's where we are looking at the frameworks or the transactions that are being issued and giving an independent objective opinion on the quality of the framework and adherence to sustainable finance principles. So impact reporting is definitely one of the core principles of the ICMA social bond principles, as well as the green bond principles and sustainability bond guidelines. So from our perspective, data is really about bringing transparency and accountability. And our role is kind of to assess the commitments on impact reporting if it's a pre-issuance review, to understand the expected social benefits that will come out of a transaction. And basically what we're doing is we're looking under the hood, trying to understand beyond that really high-level commitments of a social bond transaction, a social bond issuance, what are the specific communities being targeted, why they are considered vulnerable, and the kind of impact metrics that will be used to express or articulate the social benefits in the end. So the data component is really important. I guess, we are considered like an end user of the data that is being collected, but the ultimate aim is to support integrity and build trust in that market, and that enables capital to flow at greater scale into these socially oriented projects.
Thank you. I think that issue of supply and demand for data has come up a few times this morning, and to that issue of what is data being used for. So if I can turn to Nikki, you represent the Singapore Green Finance Centre, which was created as the designated research institution supporting Singapore's green finance agenda. How are you using data to ensure that Singapore's green and net zero objectives are inclusive? And I guess I'd like to understand from your perspective, the users of your data, your clients, if you like, is there a demand for data that connects the intersection of gender and climate action? And if there isn't, what are we doing to try and address that?
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm so grateful for the invitation to come and participate today. The Singapore Green Finance Centre was set up in 2020, which was an interesting time for Singapore because it was right around the time when the financial sector and MAS were trying to say, what can the financial sector do to support Singapore's green plan? And as a centre of excellence, it's really focused on generating research and lifting educational capability for not just Singapore, but Asia. So the reach is actually out into Asia more generally, because we know that most of the capital is not actually really deployed here. It comes from here, deployed in the region. So we're really interested in what is the impact there. We work across, we're very fortunate to have the MAS's support and continuing support for the centre, but we also have, which is very interesting, is 9 global financial institutions who partner with us. And that's really creates quite an interesting dynamic because, of course, a lot of them have data, but they're also looking for the research that we're generating. So there's a kind of nice symbiosis there. The other interesting point around it is that we work across institutions globally. We have a formal partnership with Imperial College in London, but we also work with, for example, Harvard on impact and some work that is specifically being supported by the Ford Foundation, which is a nice little connection. And that work is really going to this point of how do you evaluate impact in a way that is not an externality or an extra. How do you actually bring it into a firm's assessment of their contribution, whether it's a financial contribution or a value that they're contributing to society. And there is some excellent outputs from that, which I'm happy to share afterwards for those who are interested to see what that looks like in terms of a framework that can be applied at a corporate level, at a financial institution level. So that's an interesting framework because it not only has impact from social, has impact from green. So it's really doesn't discriminate in terms of what type of impact. It is an ability to capture all of those data points and feed them into an output. But one of the things that I was really, I was sort of nodding when the others were speaking was this idea that data has value. I remember a couple of decades ago when data sort of first became this aha moment within the financial sector that there's a value here. So it wasn't just something we collected from you when you opened a bank account and gave us your data. But now we have, and then we, had all your credit card data, of course, and then we have, so there's a whole lot of data points that the financial sector has in just the financial sector. If we look beyond that, of course, there's many, many other data points. But we had this sudden aha moment in the industry where we said, oh, this has got value. And it became, I'm not going to share it. And that I think was a real shame because monetizing value in the value of data became very proprietary and held very close. We are now in a situation we know where we're trying to get the likes of the multinational development banks to share data, and there's some progress that's been made on that. And that's data that's really important because it's data about how risky is investing in developing countries, how risky is investing in women's livelihood. And so this kind of data is, of course, very, very important. The research on the investment versus sustainable or impact investment is really, really interesting. I'll finish on this. And that is, when we look at, what are the key messages that are coming out of the research when you say what data-driven strategies are being used in finance? Enhancing decision-making and risk management, operational efficiency and innovation, challenges and regulatory considerations are the top three when we don't put the sustainability and impact lens in. As soon as we bring the words sustainability and impact lens into any of that and really trying to assess the landscape for data-driven strategies, we still have enhanced decision-making, that's a good one. But now we have 4 others. Improving transparency and accountability, maximising social and environmental returns, optimising investment strategies, interesting that wasn't in the first one, and facilitating market growth, again, wasn't in the first one. So what is it about sustainability and impact that's actually triggering us to think differently about investment and finance that's taking us beyond perhaps some old thinking?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. Nikki, it sort of potentially speaks to the elevation of the importance of those data points. And, we started off saying that what gets measured gets valued, and so if that's increasingly coming into the conversation and being demanded and tools are being created to provide that, then I think that's a positive sign. I do see we have quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just perhaps turn back to you, Zia, and get you to talk about, on behalf of the broader technology industry, which may or may not be fair, but if we want to kind of grab this opportunity that Nikki was just alluding to, how can we design that in from the outset? Can you give us some thoughts on the benefits and value of doing that, rather than perhaps trying to retrofit after the fact.
So, thank you for the work that we're doing. I think we're partners on Greenprint, and we've been thinking about sustainable Fitch as well. We're a platform company. We depend on our partners, our customers, to innovate and deliver solutions that provide better outcomes for women. I want to go to a couple of examples about how we could design things differently. If you think about data in the B2C context, I totally agree with what we're all saying. But in many ways, businesses make decisions. Businesses make decisions on data sets that they are proprietary to them at an aggregate level. So for example, what's an outcome we love to be able to see? Better health outcomes. The chief health officer of every family is the woman. And in many ways, when there's research that demonstrates that if we were able to not just fund women, educate and or give opportunity to women to get better products and services, we could see a measurable decrease in the lifestyle diseases and improvements in longevity and other health outcomes. The promise is very clear. Better decision making can't just lead to capital and to loans and to protection. It has to lead to 3, 4 big outcomes: longevity, residential optionality, climate change solutions, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose of what we're trying to do with all these systems, I'll go back to systems, is design ways in which products and services of the future make it almost magical that we deliver things like desalination, clean energy, solutions for drugs that can affect the female phenotype or the Bangladeshi phenotype. It helps increase the paucity of data in this part of the world by language and by gender, so that the systems of the future can design solutions of the future. Without it, we talked about this off stage, we won't get there, because white male data feeding a white male system will only give you white male solutions. And so we have many languages in Asia for which we don't have content. AI will help us build that. We have representations and stories that will get embedded into these systems. The reason I continue to be an optimist is that the systems that we will use to build products and design the things that we really need, bacteria that soaks up all the carbon in the earth, wonder drugs for malaria and diabetes, fusion, will come from data, but it comes from smart people. More than 50% will be women. Let's empower them.
Thank you. So, Candice, I'd like to ask you, because you deal with data all the time, what is enough? What is sufficient and efficient in terms of decision making? Because, we talked about we actually need more data from more different contexts, more variety, more diversity. But in terms of the decisions that you make, or that you provide the data to help others make, how far do we go? Because I do wonder if sometimes when it comes to gender lens investing, investing in women entrepreneurs, the bias that is in the industry, is it driving demand for types of information or amounts of information that is actually excessive, that you wouldn't ask in any other context, but because we're talking about gender or because we're talking about women, we think we need more. Do we need more, or do we just need different?
That's a great question. So as an analyst, we love data, right?
So too much is never enough, is that what you're saying?
Well, so I'll respond in this way. I think that for us, actually, it's not only the quantity, it's also the quality of the data. So I think a useful way of thinking about impact data is a system that ICMA has set out in terms of the harmonized indicators for social bond reporting, because they basically, it serves a little bit of a taxonomy for how you can think about the different types of impact data that are reported. So they distinguish between output indicators, outcome indicators, and impact indicators. And a very simple example is if we're talking about something like affordable housing, the output would be the number of housing units that are built. The outcome would be lower rent for the targeted vulnerable group. And then the impact is looking at the longer term outcomes. So that would be improve housing security in a community. So if we use this kind of framework to look at the kind of impact data that is currently being reported for a lot of the social bond transactions out there, actually a lot of it is still in the output/outcome category. And that is, to a certain extent, it doesn't give you a deeper insight into the more long-term or higher-level social implications that are being created by these social projects. So to a certain extent, I think that there is still a lot of work to be done in the kind of quality of data reporting, the thoughtfulness that goes into designing those metrics. And as analysts, we don't just look at the numbers, we also try and contextualize it. So, to a certain extent, if you look at a data set of impact metrics, it can have a certain anonymizing effect. But what we try and do in our analysis is also bring out the local context. So if we're talking about something like increasing access to finance for women, is it around addressing the barrier that is more physical, so perhaps targeting women in rural areas because they don't have access to physical bank branches? Or is it more around addressing cultural barriers? Addressing ways in which maybe societal norms don't enable women to own assets or hold savings, things like that. So we're trying to always dig deeper. So I think in a nutshell, we would say that it's more about the precision and the quality of the data being reported. And I think there is still room for improvement in terms of the thoughtfulness on the impact reporting that's out there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important, the thoughtfulness of what it is that we're collecting and what we're doing with it. Divya, I was going to ask you a question, but it's very similar to one that's come through. So, given that gender and social impact data is driven by beneficiaries on the last mile, how can we facilitate better access to these communities? Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think just building on some of the points that were shared earlier, and I think, building on the point, Nikki, that you mentioned about data having value. And that's very true, but I think one of the things that we see missing in the social impact sector is that nobody wants to pay for data collection. That is actually one of the biggest issues, right? So collecting data from remote communities is not the issue, but there's costs involved in that. It means that if you are running certain interventions, you need to send people out there, you need to collect that data, you need to analyze it. And I think for a lot of investors, for a lot of people, within the sector, they're not willing to pay for that. So I was recently actually asked at a wealth management forum on whether it was fair. And for me, the analogy is that, we're all really happy to pay for audit fees to understand the financial health of an organization. So if I'm investing in impact, then I should be willing to pay to understand the impact health of what I'm investing in, right? So for me, that I think is one of the biggest mindsets that we need to shift away from. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is also, for some of these data points that we do want to collect, are we willing to actually pay the individual for their time as well? So in Singapore, we do see that as a common practice where, when we are collecting data, if somebody is giving half an hour of their time, because some of these people are working 2 jobs a day. So if I'm taking 30 minutes of their time, like we pay them in vouchers, for example. So I think for me, that last mile is less important. For me, the bigger issue is that there is still resistance to pay for data collection.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah. Okay, so Nikki, I'm still really interested in the green-orange because we talk about it a lot, and in DFAT where I work, we have targets for climate, we have targets for gender. That is quite an ask of our staff to think about both these things and not in silos as well. So what you were saying sounds very promising, but how far along the journey do you think we are and we still have to go, and what could we all do to make that conversation easier? Because I really struggle as, the person that has to sort of advocate for these efforts, if you like, to really make, it's not so much making the case, because I think we've heard a lot about that today, but to help people with the practicalities of actually implementing it.
It's a great question, because the intersection is one that we all go, yep, and then we go away and we do separate analysis, or we do separate things. So it's a very challenging one. We even do that at the centre ourselves. So we work across 5 research themes. One that'll be very familiar to everybody: transition, resilience, nature, the markets, so carbon and capital markets, and impact. And everyone says to me, why is impact separate? Yeah, I know. It sort of runs right through all of them. It really is, it is a thematic that goes through across all of those themes. So whilst we also fall into that trap as an institution that is there to sort of try to understand this better, there is, as I said, the work that is going on with impact research, actually bringing multiple data points or multiple thematics into that impact assessment. So just to I'll take a little bit further and give you a sense of where that's going in terms of research. The intention is to be able to bring those impact values on to the P&L balance sheet. So in other words, we won't have separate impact reports anymore. So the idea of this is to then be able to, of course, if it's going to be a P&L balance sheet, we've got to be able to quantify it in dollar terms. And so this is the work that's going on at the moment, is to be able to say, how do you compare having gender balance with having climate action that's going to hit the 2050 target? So there's there's a lot of modelling that's going on behind that to establish how we can make those comparisons.
Okay, I'm getting the winded up signal. Oh, only for the questions. Oh, that's good. I already sort of started on the questions.
Can I build on that,
Sure.
on the conversation? I see a couple of the questions here, and one of the interesting ones is, how's AI going to impact disadvantaged communities? But I want to bring it back to insight. Data drives insights. I want to tell 3 quick stories about insights that might relate to how we keep women's livelihood growing and flourishing. Let's start with return to work if you're ill. If you enter a healthcare system, if you had data and a decision-making process that predicted what would shorten the amount of time it took for a woman to return from the healthcare system back to work, what would you predict is the one thing that you would need to deliver worldwide, population-wide? The answer is, from data analysis, a nutritious shake. Upon arrival into the healthcare system, give somebody a nutritious shake, because certain elements of nutrients get you a better health outcome. More than anything else that you can do around the healthcare system, feed them. Number 2, when is the time you stop giving somebody a loan? For a man, the 5th to the 6th loan. For a woman, the 6th to the 8th loan, for example. Insight on the basis of how much more creditworthy a woman is. Aggregate, generic, but an insight that comes from deep analysis. And then maybe the third one would be, when it comes to something that we all need in the future, which is decentralized energy, basically delivering autonomy from the grid in a renewable fashion. What do we use all the time, day in, day out, is batteries, especially in villages. And by using technology and insights, we can create better batteries for villages that will last longer duration, with more natural ingredients that will benefit and allow businesses to flourish for longer periods of time without electricity. These are all things that are enablers that come through insights, not B2C data, but broader population level data about what we could do to create business opportunity.
And I just wanted to add to what Zia was just saying on that point on how can AI impact disadvantaged communities? I think one of the biggest issues, and speaking from a philanthropist's perspective, I think one of the biggest issues that we see in the development sector is actually huge fragmentation of data. We don't have access to government data to really understand what are the biggest social issues, how much are they costing the government, you know? As philanthropists, what could we focus on? That, you know, it's kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? Where can I put like 20% of my resources to get 80% of the results? So that data is missing. What's also missing is, you know, sometimes we're working on a particular issue. So, I mean, if I was to take the example of maternal and child health, but there could actually be 5 other organizations working on exactly the same issue. We sometimes find ourselves going into communities where we have been invited to train, you know, community health workers on maternal health, but we're actually the 3rd service provider, giving them, you know, the same training for the 3rd time. Like, it's just not a good use of resources. So I think, again, if we could have data at that meta level, which really tells us where are the hot spots, where are the areas that really need prioritization and support, I think we could be so much more efficient with our capital as well.
Yeah, good point.
I want to just add something very quickly. That's where policy has to come in, because we all want to protect our data. That's fair. We all have a personal level of data that we don't want necessarily shared, just because someone will pay for it, right? So this is something that I think is really important when we talk about insights, when we talk about, you know, how to access good data. There is a huge amount of data out there, we know that. It's a question of how do we ensure that it's accessed in the right ways, that policy supports the access of that in a way that respects our privacy, that respects our individual rights, and still gives us enough to be able to then analyse that data and make some sense of it that we can make decisions on. So I think policy is something that's really, we haven't really talked about, but it's a big one when it comes to the whole question of data.
Yeah, thanks Nikki for bringing that up, because it was on my notes too. You know, if we get time, talk about those issues around the safety and security of data, you know, particularly when it comes to privacy issues and safety for women. But we're probably going to run out of time quite quickly, and there are just a couple more questions from the audience. So Sustainable Fitch is one of the largest green bond second opinion providers in the market. Do you see market interest on Orange?
Yes, so we definitely see growing interest. But to put it in perspective, social bonds, social loans is still a small sliver of the larger labeled bond market, still not as popular or as widespread as compared to green bonds. I think a lot of that probably has to do with some of the impact data reporting aspects and expectations around it. But we do see often in social bonds and sustainability bonds, there will be use of proceeds that are looking at targeting women, either through things like SME lending, through things like increasing access to financial services. So there are, quite a range of projects out there that do support gender positive outcomes. But putting specifically the orange label on it, I think that will come with time, but we do see increasing interest in the market to do that.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting if those investors that are interested in green, when that's their primary driver, if we can get this message out that, well, if you want to do an effective green investment, you really have to have orange overlaid on that in order to get the financial and the impact that you are seeking. And so hopefully, by stealth almost, because I have heard over the years I've been working in this that people who are interested in the social aspects of investing are quite open to the green issues. People who are primarily driven by green are less amenable to hearing the messages around the social or the gender aspects of investment. Now, I don't know how. It sort of makes intuitive sense. I don't know how true it is across the board, but I think it is an interesting thing to reflect on as we, create products. We decide the sort of data points that we're going to collect and use to try and bring those things together. In the last 5 minutes, any final reflections?
Can I give you a data point on that? The most recent number that I could find was 2021. The intersection the intersection of climate finance and gender finance is 0.01% of total.
Yeah.
So it's tiny. Now that might have grown.
A lot of work to do.
Maybe all the orange bond works made that grow, but that's very, very small.
Yeah. In the last 4.5 minutes, would any of our other panellists like to make any final observations, as they say, or any? There is one more question there, but it's I think you have. So, any last words from anyone? Sorry, that's really cruel, isn't it? I should be wrapping up. I'm the moderator. But
maybe, I represent an American company that has global interests, and we talked about it in the morning, but I think Rob said it. It may be, or Time Lord, this may be our time to demonstrate a completely different type of product with alpha, with better returns, focused on a community that's overlooked, that will deliver sustainable returns for a very, very long time. Forget about what's happening in the US. There's 75% of the world's economy that could benefit from something like this. And that predictive nature of this is a good investment, it's the best data you can provide. It just works.
Thank you, Zia. We'll leave it with the optimist. I mean, we're all optimists, I think. But thank you so much to the panel. Great variety of perspectives there. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.